Hello guys and welcome back to FatbossTV, and we're doing some more raid previews.
Yep.
We were pretty much done, as some of you kind of noticed, because we haven't uploaded a raid preview in a very, very long time. And the reason for that was because the two bosses that were left, which is this encounter that we're doing today, and Cenarius, when we did test them first time round, we didn't really get the footage we wanted. However, the bosses did come back up for testing on normal mode, and we've managed to get a bit more information about the encounters and can sort of show you a rough idea how the bosses work. Of course, this is a preview. When the bosses do hit live servers, it's likely they'll be different. And also, we will be doing the heroic guides like we always do on live servers, and that'll give you a far better idea of how the encounters work. Let's go on with the video anyway, maybe you'll get something out of it, and let's talk about it. So, the Dragons of Nightmare, which is in the Emerald Nightmare, this encounter, we're not exactly sure where it's placed in the instance. It feels like you can almost do it whenever you like.
Yeah, after you've killed Ysondre, then you can literally go to it whenever you like. It's kind of like one of the 4 choices you get to do before you have to go to Cenarius and then Xavius. It's an interesting encounter though. It consists of fighting 3 dragons, but it's out of a possible, like a pool of dragons of 4. We're not 100% sure how this is going to work. Is it going to be like a rotation from week to week, like Paragons of the Klaxi was supposed to be?
Yeah.
Or is it going to become a set order? Or
it could be like a raid ID by raid ID basis, which would be a little bit odd, especially when it comes down to Mythic. Although said that,
on Mythic you do all of them at once.
It's all 4, yeah. Okay.
But yeah, this encounter is quite reminiscent of something like the 4 Horsemen in Naxxramas, where you've got like giant auras that you need to deal with, and you've got to do a lot of like big movements around. It's quite interesting like that. But generally speaking, the encounter does have some very simple abilities, but it's the way that these abilities work with one another that does actually make it quite a fun fight to be in.
Now, before we talk about what dragon does what, we should really talk about how the fight sort of works, because it's slightly unusual. At the beginning of the encounter, you'll always have Ysondre, and she will always be accompanied by one other random dragon. All of these dragons have a shared health pool, and once you get the bosses to certain health intervals, they'll fly up into the air, and whatever one is already flying up in the air will come and land down. So at 70% health, one of them will fly away, another one will come down. At 40% health, they'll then do it again, but it'll always be the same dragon, so you'll just have one dragon that's never in the encounter. Now, while these dragons are flying up in the air, you can't actually do any damage to them, and in normal mode, they don't do anything at all. They just stand there and look pretty. In Heroic and in Mythic, you'll get extra mechanics that you have to deal with that will be bombarding your raid the entire time they're up there. Now, all of these dragons do share some abilities. There's a breath that the tanks need to deal with. It's just a frontal cone. You need to make sure that you're facing these dragons away from the raid. But the most important thing about these dragons, and the main reason why they're so spread apart that you can see on screen now, is because they have an aura around them. Now, this aura simply just constantly applies debuffs to anyone within 45 yards of the mob. This debuff is specific to each dragon, so it's completely unique to them. All these debuffs do is just apply a small amount of ticking damage to you that slowly creeps up. However, once the debuff reaches 10 stacks, that player is just flat out stunned for 30 seconds and you're going to wipe. So you need to make sure that no one in the raid ever gets to 10 stacks. And the way that you can do this is simply by splitting up the raid into 2 groups. And as soon as you get, say, 7 to 8 stacks, get your tanks to move over towards the other group, taunt the dragons, and you just swap them. And it's as simple as that.
Yeah, as long as you keep doing this, nobody will ever reach 10 stacks of any of the given marks, so nobody will ever get stunned, which is great. And by the time you actually want to switch again, your debuff should have dropped, so it should be safe to switch again without getting even more stacks of the like original debuff that you had. And you do need to continue doing this throughout the entire encounter, so you're always going to need to be spread into these 2 little groups, and you're always going to have to, be running from side to side. So there's quite a lot of movement for the tanks. It's quite a neat little tank switch mechanic rather than taunt on 2. It's like move a whole dragon across the room on 8. Now they're the shared abilities that the dragons have. Let's look at each dragon individually to see what they do. And let's start with Ysondre, which is like the main dragon. You'll always have her. One of her main abilities that she does is call Defiled Spirit. This makes it so a large purple circle will spawn on a random ranged player. And at the same time, all players within this circle will be rooted. And after a short time, the circle will explode, dealing a shit ton of damage to anyone who's still inside of it. Now, the players within the circle need to be dispelled, which will remove the root so they can move out and avoid the explosion. You also want to consider probably being spread out when this ability is coming in. If you are properly spread, only one person should ever get rooted at any given time, meaning that your healers will have to dispel less. And of course, if too many people do get rooted, you won't have enough dispels to break all of the different roots, and somebody's probably going to get hit by it and maybe even die. Do take into account that you can use things that remove roots, such as Blessing of Freedom. I'm sure Disengage with certain talents works as well, so
Blink.
Yeah, Blink works as well, so use all that kind of stuff. And her other ability is Nightmare Blast. This will launch a ball of purple shit towards a player's location, indicated by like a purple swirly circle. Players hit by this will take some damage and be knocked back from this location. Whether a player is hit or not though, this Nightmare Blast will always spawn a Nightmare Bloom flower. Now these Nightmare Bloom flowers will deal damage to anyone standing within them every 3 seconds. However, if nobody is standing within them, they'll instead spawn a little ad called a Dread Horror. These Dread Horror ads don't really do much on normal mode, they just kind of go around and melee hit people. However, on Heroic and higher, they do have a 5-yard aura which causes players within the aura to deal 50% reduced damage. So on both normal and heroic regardless, the ads are generally a pain in the arse. You always want to have a single player stood within the Nightmare Bloom flower just to stop any of them from spawning. Healers just need to keep an eye on that player because of course they'll be taking ticking damage over like the duration of a minute while the flower is still active, and any of the Dread Horror ads that do end up spawning do need to be killed off as soon as possible, preferably range DPS as they will not be in range of the damage reduction aura, so you should be able to kill them off relatively quickly.
So those two abilities you have to deal with the entire fight because Ysondre's up the entire fight. Let's talk about the other dragons. Let's talk about Taerar first. On a timer, Taerar will spawn 2 different shade versions of himself. These versions have slightly less health, deal slightly less damage, but they still have the Nightmare Breath ability, and when this does come in, the tank's going to be taking a shit ton of damage because he's going to be taking 3 breaths rather than just 1. So it's very important that as soon as they are picked up, like the other dragons, face them away from the raid, and you want everyone to go absolutely nuts on them and just cleave them down as soon as you possibly can. On top of this, he'll also do Seeping Fog, which will just spawn multiple patches of green fog that will just slowly drift around. If anyone comes into contact with the fog, you'll be put to sleep for 6 seconds and take some ticking damage on top of it. The fog appears to only target ranged players when it initially spawns, so it's probably a good idea to have range far away from melee while this mob is up, just to make sure the melee don't get instantly screwed over. And something to keep in mind, if someone does get screwed over, you can dispel them just to remove the debuff. Now in Heroic, Taerar will also do Bellowing Roar. This only ever happens however when he's in the air. Occasionally he'll just do this ability and it will just fear everyone in the raid for 3 seconds. Now this is your typical fear, so you will just run in a random direction for 3 seconds, which means you could potentially run into say a fog patch which kind of sucks, or maybe you'll move out of a Nightmare Bloom and ads will keep spawning. So the roar is really annoying. Initially when we tested this on Heroic, you couldn't actually dispel the fear, but after doing Mythic testing, it seems that Blizzard changed their mind and maybe you can dispel it now. We haven't done Heroic since because you can't, so we don't actually know for sure, but if it is dispellable, you could potentially use immunities before the fear comes in and dispel important targets such as your tank or maybe the person that's supposed to be soaking the bloom or anything like that.
Moving on to the next dragon, which is Emeriss. This dragon has a fairly vicious debuff that will apply to players called Volatile Infection. This is just placed on a random player and it will just deal ticking damage to the target as well as anyone within 10 yards of them every 3 seconds. And the debuff lasts for 1.5 minutes and it isn't dispellable. So yeah, it's pretty shitty. If you get this debuff, make sure you move out of your group. Healers, you just got to make sure you keep these players topped up. And if you do have this debuff, you might want to avoid doing other jobs that deal damage to you, such as soaking Nightmare Bloom flowers. However, it might be easier for some healers if you have 1 person taking all the damage rather than like 3, so it's kind of depending on your healer setup. The other thing that Emeriss will be doing while he's on the ground is something called Essence of Corruption. These are just ads that will spawn periodically around this dragon. They will just melee hit the tank and occasionally cast Corruption, which will deal a huge burst of damage to everyone in the raid, even the people on the in the opposite group. Now this Corruption cast is interruptible and it is super important that it is interrupted. Raid-wide damage should be avoided as much as possible, and these ads generally don't have a lot of HP so they can be killed off very quickly, so don't let them cast, kill them off super quick and you can just ignore them. Now while Emeriss is up in the air, and this only applies to heroic difficulties or higher, he'll be doing something called Corruption of the Dream. This will buff all enemies, making it so if they die, they'll spawn a mushroom. This mushroom will then explode shortly afterwards and deal a large amount of damage to anyone nearby. So when this buff is up, you just need to make sure that you move away from any ads that you do end up killing, and ideally, you shouldn't really have many ads up anyway if you're stopping the majority of them spawning from like the Nightmare Bloom flowers, but any ads that do spawn, either wait for this buff to drop or just kill them off nice and quick and make sure you're nowhere near the fucking mushrooms.
And finally, the dragon that we have not seen in any testing whatsoever,
unfortunately, yeah,
is Lethon, but we'll go over his abilities really quickly. One of them is Gloom. This apparently is a series of nightmares that fall from above that just deals damage to the players in the impact area. So this is going to be some sort of comet ability.
It kind of just sounds like, say, like Fell Hellfire on...
just don't stand in the shit.
Don't stand in shit, yeah.
He also has Siphon Spirit. This pulls a soul fragment out of a player, drawing them towards himself. If it reaches Lethon, it will heal him for a shit ton. So have players stack away from the boss, and then when the soul does spawn, nuke the living shit out of it. Whether you can slow these souls or stun them or anything like that, we have no idea. But yeah, they might be things to try, I guess. And while the boss is up in the air on heroic and high difficulties, he will do something called Shadow Burst. which makes him mark a player, and then after 10 seconds, that player will apply a debuff to the nearest 3 players. This debuff will deal ticking damage and slow the movement speed of the players by 10% for 21 seconds, and it appears that this ability will likely stack. So how you're probably going to do it is you'll need to make sure that you rotate small groups of players to be next to this mark each time, so that, you know, the stack doesn't go too high and these players can't move from other abilities that are going on. And that's all it is to this encounter, so it's not very complex at all. It's just all about getting that tank swap down. If you can do the tank swap and you don't stand in bad shit and you stand inside a flower, that's pretty much it.
Yeah, that's actually a very good summary of the fight. Just stand in a flower and do the tank switch. That's what you need to do.
Yeah.
That's pretty much it.
It's a very, very simple encounter.
It's still quite nice, though, especially on Heroic when they are doing those air abilities. Like, when we was doing it on Heroic testing the first time, the fear would last like 10 seconds and it wouldn't be dispellable, and everyone would just instantly die when the fear came out.
Yeah, and also the problem on Heroic when we did the first testing was that the stacks that the boss gave you through the aura lasted way too long,
yes.
so you couldn't actually do the tank swap.
Yeah, you needed 4 tanks to do it properly.
Yeah.
And that's what we did end up doing, but even then it was like super difficult, super weird, and it didn't make any sense. But yeah, it seems to have been fixed now, and it is going to be it looks like to be a relatively easy fight. There is some really cool extra things coming in on Mythic. You see those portals around the side of the room? You can actually enter them. On Heroic and Lower, it's just for an achievement. However, on Mythic, you're going in there and they take you to different worlds, and you have to kill ads in there. It's really fucking cool. So this fight looks to be a very, very good one.
But thank you very much for watching, guys. That's pretty much all we've got on this boss, which is a bit of a shame. It would have been nice to have shown you Lethon and everything else that's involved on Heroic, but yeah, we were really limited. But hopefully this video helps you before these bosses do hit on live servers. And if you enjoyed the video, slap a like on it. It helps us out a lot. And if you'd like to support the channel, we are now on Patreon. We'll be releasing a video talking more about how we're going to be doing Patreon in the future when we come back from Gamescom. But for now, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.
Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching.